The sun was already sinking low over the ragged horizon of Dry Creek when Eliza Holloway tightened her shawl against the gritty wind that swept through the empty Main Street. It had been 7 years since her husband's passing, and in that time, the once bustling town had withered into little more than a whisper of its former self. Eliza had learned to keep her head down, tend her modest homestead, and avoid whatever trouble seemed to ride in with the dust. That day, however, was different. Trouble hadn't just ridden in, it had been dragged in, bound, bleeding, and dumped, like a sack of feed in the middle of the street. The man was massive, shirtless, his muscled torso crisscrossed with lash marks, his wrists tied cruelly behind his back in a coarse burlap sack. Over his head, 4 armed men stood around him, their spurs jingling as they exchanged low, mocking laughs. From her porch, Eliza caught fragments of their jeers, something about a bounty, something about justice, but their eyes gleamed too much for it to be justice. She knew the type. They didn't care what this man had done. They cared about coin, and they'd wring it out of him however they could. She should have looked away. She should have turned back inside, locked her door, and let whatever fate was meant for him play out. But something about the way he moved or didn't move kept her rooted. Even kneeling in the dirt, even with his head covered, there was a coiled stillness in him, as if every muscle waited for the moment to strike. Then, one of the men pulled the sack just high enough to reveal a pair of eyes, and Eliza's breath caught. They were sharp, cold, and oddly calm, like he'd been expecting her all along. That was when he spoke, voice low but carrying across the empty street like the wind itself. "You saved me. You'll regret it." The words should have pushed her back inside, yet they pulled her forward. She didn't even remember stepping off her porch until her boots scuffed the dirt and all 4 men turned to glare at her. "Get back inside, widow," one snarled. "Ain't your business." She hesitated only a second before forcing her voice steady. "Whatever he's done, it doesn't need to end like this." The tallest of them grinned without warmth. "Lady, you got no idea who you're talking for." The prisoner didn't flinch, didn't look at her again, but she could feel the weight of his presence, heavy as the desert heat. A plan began to form, reckless and foolish, but her mind wouldn't let go. That night, long after the men had dragged him to the old livery they used as a holding pen, Eliza crept through the dark, her heart pounding in her ears. She'd brought a small knife and a water canteen, telling herself she was only going to give him a drink, maybe ask what crime had earned him such wrath. She found him slumped against a post, ropes biting into his skin, the burlap sack still over his head. When she whispered his name, though she didn't know how she knew it, he stiffened. "Don't," he murmured. "If you're smart, you'll walk away now." But she didn't. With quick, trembling hands, she cut the ropes and pulled the sack free. She expected bruises, scars, maybe the hard face of an outlaw. She didn't expect the truth. His eyes met hers in the moonlight, and she saw not cruelty, but something worse, something hunted, desperate, and dangerous in ways she couldn't yet understand. "They'll kill you for this," he said quietly, flexing his freed wrists. "And if they don't, I might." Before she could answer, a noise outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, too many to fight. Moving fast, he grabbed her wrist, his grip iron strong, and in one fluid motion pulled her into the shadows. They slipped out a back door and into the maze of alleyways, every sound magnified in the stillness. By the time they reached the edge of town, her breath was ragged, her mind whirling with questions she didn't dare ask. He stopped suddenly, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "We ain't safe yet," he said, almost to himself, "but we will be if you can keep up." Something in his tone told her he wasn't asking. She followed anyway, the dry earth crunching beneath their boots as they disappeared into the dark. Hours later, they reached an abandoned line shack miles from town, the wind rattling loose boards like bones. He lit no lantern, speaking only when necessary, every word edged with warning. She learned his name, Calder, and nothing more. When dawn crept over the desert, Eliza awoke to find him gone. Panic flared until she saw the burlap sack lying in the corner, something heavy inside. Her hands shook as she opened it, and what she found made her blood run cold. She stared, unblinking, as the truth settled like a stone in her chest. Whatever Calder was, whatever she'd just stepped into, there was no going back. And somewhere in the stillness outside, she thought she heard his voice again, carried on the wind. "I told you, widow, you'll regret it." Friends, this is just the beginning. Chapter 2 will take you deeper into the mystery, danger, and the shocking reason Eliza froze when she looked into that sack. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. You won't believe what happens next. Asterisk. Eliza didn't breathe for what felt like an eternity. As her fingers hovered over the rough edges of the burlap, the pale gold of dawn seeping through the cracks in the walls, casting long slashes of light across the floorboards, she had been ready for money, stolen coins, maybe gold dust, something that explained the men's greed. But what lay within was far stranger: a leather-bound ledger, worn smooth at the edges, and beside it, wrapped in oilcloth, a Colt revolver so polished it looked almost ceremonial. She touched neither at first, afraid that the moment she did, something irreversible would happen. Her mind spun through 100 questions. Why carry a ledger instead of loot? Why keep it hidden like it was worth more than life itself? When she finally cracked the ledger open, her eyes widened at the neat columns of names, dates, and locations, all written in a firm, deliberate hand. Many of the names she recognized, men from Dry Creek, some from towns over, a few long dead, under mysterious circumstances, but others had marks beside them. Strange symbols she didn't understand. A shiver ran through her, not from the chill of morning, but from the creeping realization that she was holding something people would kill to bury. Her thoughts were interrupted by the slow creak of the shack's door. Calder stepped inside, his movements precise, scanning every corner before meeting her gaze. The light caught his face fully now, and she saw just how much had been done to him. Cuts stitched in haste, bruises blooming dark along his jaw, but his eyes were sharp and unflinching. "You looked," he said flatly, and it wasn't a question. She swallowed. "It's a list. But of what?" His jaw tightened. "Not what, who. Every man in that book's either bought, sold, or buried a secret that could tear half this territory apart." He crossed the room, took the ledger from her and slid it back into the sack with the revolver. "Now you know too much." She straightened her spine despite the prickle of fear. "If that's true, those men back in town ain't the only ones after me." He cut in. "And now they'll be after you." Her pulse hammered. "So what's your plan? Run until they give up?" His faint smirk held no humor. "They don't give up." He began to pack, moving with a speed and economy of motion that told her he'd done this many times before. "We head west," he said. "There's someone out there who can keep you alive, if you're smart enough to follow orders." She didn't ask who. Something in his tone told her she might not like the answer. By midday, they were riding borrowed horses across the open plains, the sun a merciless weight overhead. Calder spoke little, his attention always roving the horizon, the ridges, the sky. Twice he led them off the trail to skirt unseen riders moving in the distance. When they stopped to water the horses at a shallow creek, Eliza finally asked, "Why did you tell me I'd regret saving you?" He knelt to refill a canteen, his reflection fractured in the rippling water. "Because every person who's tried before you is either dead or wishes they were." The bluntness of it stole her words. They rode on, silence stretching between them until the land began to rise into rocky hills. As evening fell, they made camp in a narrow canyon, the high walls hiding their firelight. Over a tin of beans, Calder finally began to talk, not about himself, but about the ledger. Each name was a thread in a web of bribes, killings, and betrayals reaching far beyond Dry Creek. "There's a war comin'," he said, staring into the flames. "And every man in that book's picking a side. Me, I'm trying to burn the whole thing down before it starts." She wanted to ask which side he was truly on, but the sound of distant hoof beats froze the words in her throat. Calder was on his feet in an instant, fire kicked out, revolver in hand. "They found us," he said, voice low and certain. "They broke camp in seconds, leading the horses up a narrow ledge trail until they reached a ridge overlooking the canyon floor. Below, a half-dozen riders moved like shadows in the moonlight, their faces hidden by bandanas, rifles slung across their backs. Eliza's stomach knotted as one of them held up a lantern, casting light over the spot they'd camped just moments Earlier, we got maybe an hour before they circle ahead, Calder murmured. They rode hard through the night, the land blurring into dark shapes and silver light. By dawn, the hills gave way to a sprawling basin, and in the center of it stood an old mission. Its whitewashed walls weathered and cracked. San Telmo, Calder said. Last place they'll expect us if we're lucky. Inside, the mission smelled of dust and candle wax. An old priest, stooped but sharp-eyed, greeted Calder with a nod that spoke of long acquaintance. She's with me, Calder said before the man could ask. The priest led them to a back room and barred the door. Only when they were alone again did Calder set the sack on the table and push it toward her. You want to know why I'm still alive? He asked. Slowly, she unwrapped the revolver this time, finding an engraving along the barrel, a coiled serpent biting its own tail. Beneath it, a single word, her surname, Holloway. Her breath caught. Why is my name on this? His gaze was steady, unreadable. Because this fight started with your husband, and it's gonna end with you. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as the weight of his words settled over her. Outside, the first rays of sun lit the desert in gold, but in Eliza's chest, a storm was brewing. She realized then that Calder hadn't just dragged her into his war, he was handing her a role she didn't yet understand. And somewhere beyond the mission walls, the riders were still coming. Friends, this is the twist that changes everything. What happens next will decide whether Eliza survives or becomes the last name written in that ledger. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the final reckoning. You will not believe how this ends. Asterisk.